I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And I'm Jeremy Carl.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, today we've got a number of good topics for you. First, obviously, we're going to talk about the group chat that leaked to Jeffrey Goldberg about the Houthis strike. Second, Jeremy is going to talk about the president's power to deport visa holders. Third, Inez is going to talk about the steps that President Trump is taking to close the Department of Education. And finally, Amber is going to talk about how the Democrats are on the hunt for new leadership. But first, we're talking about the Houthis group chat, which has dominated the news for the past couple of days. Basically, Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic, which is a notoriously awful publication, but we'll indulge him for the moment, published an article saying that he managed to get randomly invited and placed within a group chat with a number of prominent officials in the government, including, a key group chat including Michael Waltz, the National Security Advisor, J.D. Vance, the Vice President, Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, Tulsi Gabbard, John Ratcliffe. So, a huge number of people, and somehow he finds his way into this group chat where they're first kind of discussing whether they should be attack, whether and when they should attack the Houthis. And then afterwards, there was a discussion about this fact that the strike was incoming, and Pete Hegseth posted a sort of timeline of when certain things would be happening without very much granular detail in terms of sources or methods or specific locations, but just gave people a timeline of when things would be happening. And Jeffrey Goldberg was sat there and passively listened to this, only a couple days ago decided to finally publish an article saying that he got invited to this group chat. And all of a sudden, all the senior Democrats are seemingly very well briefed on this issue. So it seems quite clear that Mr. Goldberg was perfectly happy to sit and accrue all this information and then attempt to spring it on Republicans at a time that would be politically damaging to them. That seems obvious. In terms of what actually happened here, is this some disastrous leak of classified information that did real damage to the country? No. Should these conversations have been happening on Signal? Probably not, or at least not a version of Signal that could have conceivably been accessed by a journalist. I think that the right take on this, Ari Fleischer actually had a really good tweet on what should happen here. And, he basically said, quote, "I don't think this is complicated. The ongoing mission against Yemen was and is a success. Keep it up. Internal communications were not handled well. The info about the strike should have been classified, and it should remain so. Signal is not for classified comms, period. The White House needs to figure out how it mistakenly put a journalist on its comms list, and the Secretary of Defense should admit he put info out there that was a mistake, but no one needs to lose their jobs, and everyone needs to learn from their mistakes," which I think is the exact right take, right? It's not like we want this to happen again, but nobody needs to get fired over this. And I was talking to another friend of mine who's militarily, he's in military NatSec stuff, and he's like, they just need to create an instance of Signal that only government employees can be using. There should be no intermingling of your contacts list between your government employee friends and your personal contacts, which is how somehow Jeffrey Goldberg got access to this chat. If you do that, Signal is end-to-end encrypted, so it is perfectly suitable for these sort of real-time, sensitive but unclassified conversations. So that's not the idea that conversations like this could conceivably happen on Signal isn't the problem. The problem is really that this, they have an instance that conceivably could be accessed by reporters. The only other thing I'll point out is that the Wall Street Journal tried to do this, argue that Steve Witkoff, because he was in Russia, could have easily leaked this information to the Russians. That was false, because Witkoff didn't bring his personal device and didn't have access to Signal when he was in Russia, because we aren't completely incompetent here. So that was wrong. But I think, it's not that there's nothing that needs to be fixed as a result of this. I think that, clearly this is just a giant wake-up call for the administration about needing to do a better job of properly securing sensitive but unclassified communications. But I think it's certainly overblown by the press and by the Democrats. But I'm curious about what you all think.
Yeah, I certainly agree that it's overblown, but they just released the text messages, which, the administration basically dared Jeffrey Goldberg to do it, and he did. It is pretty close to, I don't know what, the technical definition of war plans is, but it has specific times and targets that conceivably, somebody involved in this, or an enemy of the United States would be able to decode and translate to, specific locations. It is pretty bad. I also don't think that this is the sort of thing where, yeah, it's a really big screw up. I'm not going to use the term I actually want to use. It's a snafu, right? It is a big screw up. They did add this guy, right, to a very, very sensitive chat. They should essentially, in my view, they should just take the L and they should just say, like, yeah, this was a big screw up. We're taking steps to make sure that it never happens again. That's it. Like, I also, could it have been really bad? Yes. Was it really bad? No. And it is kind of amusing that this story has overtaken the very successful strike against the Houthis itself, right? So like the actual content of what this chat was about has happened. It was successful. That seems to be that seems to me to be the more important thing. This is something that, it is an error by everybody involved, and particularly by the guy who actually, fat finger added Jeffrey Goldberg to this chat. I'm not even sure, sorry to be like the fly in the ointment here, but I'm not even sure we really can criticize Jeffrey Goldberg for this. Like, obviously, generally, I would like to criticize Jeffrey Goldberg, but I mean, I think almost any journalist, you get this kind of opportunity. Of course, you're going to sit there and then try to write stories based on it. I mean, I in this particular instance, I think he acted actually pretty well, in the sense that, of course, he could publish this before it happened and didn't. So anyway, bottom line, this is a big screw up. I don't think it's an end of the world screw up. I don't think it's a 3 weeks of news items screw up, and they should just sort of say, whoops, our bad. This was a problem. We fixed it. It'll never happen again. Next question. That's really my take on this.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. And I frankly wouldn't have left the chat until they realized I was in there. So the fact that he like voluntarily left after the strike is kind of interesting. But yeah, it's a screw up. I don't think there's any other way to put it. And I think the White House got themselves made it even more of a scandal with their boneheaded response to it. Like you said, Inez, practically daring Jeffrey Goldberg to release the text from Hegseth that included the exact timing of certain strikes, including what kind of weapon systems they were going to be using. Just talking to people who served in the military, they're like, I don't see how this could not be classified, but I guess they're sort of working on semantics at this point, whether it's war plans or attack plans. And it kind of feels like they're treating us like we're stupid. Like, we can read the text ourselves. This is obviously should not have been in a chat on Signal, least of which with a journalist. And one of the questions that I've been thinking about is, Mike Waltz has been sort of running around claiming that he's never talked to Jeffrey Goldberg and he didn't even have his number, yet somehow he added him to this chat. That doesn't seem very believable to me. From the beginning, when he was first nominated to this position, I was kind of concerned about him because he's generally more hawkish than President Trump and a lot of these other cabinet officials. And this kind of feels like those concerns were pretty valid. I just don't buy that this randomly happened for no reason, and that Waltz has never contacted Jeffrey Goldberg before. They haven't at least had a conversation. Goldberg admitted in the original piece that came out on Monday in The Atlantic that they had actually met before and talked in person, but didn't say whether they had communicated through other means and methods. Regarding what the accountability structure should be for this, it sucks that we have to do this, but this is politics. When you go back to the Biden administration, there were no top military officials who were fired for the disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal that led to the deaths of 13 service members. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin broke chain of command, disappeared without telling anybody for a life-altering surgery. You had numerous other foreign policy snafus under Biden where nobody was held accountable. So the standard has been set, in my opinion. Why hand a scalp to the Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, the Democrats, when they would be perfectly happy to pretend that this was no big deal if they were in office? I really think that's the posture that you have to take as a Republican Party if you intend to wield any kind of power while you're in power, if you're willing to win. So that's kind of where I'm at. This was a huge mistake. The White House's response was severely lacking. I don't think it's particularly defensible. I also don't feel like Trump needs to go in and clean house or anything of that nature.
Yeah. Yeah, people are forcing me to try to care about this much more than I do. And I mean, maybe I should, but it's just like, stupid. But at the end of the day, nothing was harmed by it. They need to put in, I liked your idea of a specific instance of signal that would be only for um, government employees. And I actually do think that the only things about this that truly are interesting to me are the two meta thing points that have been raised, not having to do so much with the conversation itself, but one, is Mike Waltz talking to Jeffrey Goldberg? There were people, Sean Davis from the Federalist strongly suggested that that was going on. I mean, I assume he doesn't have any classified particular intel to suggest that that's the case, but Sean's a pretty smart guy, and um, that should be concerning. And I know for folks who had concerns about maybe Waltz's hawkishness more generally, that should certainly be investigated, and we should get to the bottom of that and make sure it happens again. Not doesn't happen again, rather. I think the other thing that I would worry about um, is that I've heard people suggest this is actually arguably the biggest thing to me about the entire thing incident, that this is being used as a way to get the Trump administration off of Signal and onto more discoverable by nefarious deep state actors forms of communication that can then be leaked. And I do have that concern. I mean, again, the Biden administration has set the precedent that we can use Signal, at least for certain types of communications between government actors. And I am a little bit wary that this is really going to be used as an attempt to kind of make that somehow verboten, even for non-classified information. But yeah, look, not the Trump administration's finest moment, to be sure. But again, I don't know. I mean, I just have a hard time caring about this as much as a lot of people in the media seem to.
That's about right. All right. Well, next up is Jeremy regarding the power of the president to deport visa holders.
Yeah, thanks. And I feel a little bit silly here. I'm basically almost going to toss this to some degree to Will and Inez. Amber, I believe, like me, you're not foolish enough to have gotten a law degree. So I'm going to punt a little bit on my substantive expertise and just kind of give you the vibes, man, which is, um, on the substantive particular instance, I'm in favor of deporting the various people I've heard about being deported. The most recent of which is now this Korean national who's, I guess, been in the U.S. since she's 7. But my view is like, again, and we can be corrected if there's really some deep law reason that it can't be this way. But it's just like, if you're a foreign national, the president, you don't have a right to be here. The president, if they decide that you shouldn't be here for reasons of the national interest, that ought to be it. Like the notion that this can be subject to these, insane processes just indicates to me, to the extent that any of this is legally valid, of the complete overreach of the deep state into every form of democratic accountability. I mean, if the president is deigning, even indirectly, to worry about the minutiae so much that he has specifically signaled you out as somebody we don't want in the United States, that should be it. I mean, now obviously if you're a citizen or whatever, that's totally different. But if you're just a visitor here, like that's it. And so I'm just kind of, again, maybe it goes back to what I was saying in the other chat of I just have a hard time caring about that as much as people do. I have a hard time taking even seriously the notion that the president just doesn't kind of get to decide on this type of stuff, and there shouldn't be these month-long bureaucratic processes, and that to the extent that there are these month-long processes, it's kind of an offense to any notion of democratic self-government, that this is the sort of decision that we empower under the Constitution the president to make. And every time he wants to send somebody back, it can't be the subject of this endless political back and forth. And I think it was the Babylon Bee had something about district court orders astronauts to be returned to space station, right? And that's kind of where I feel like we are at this point with some of these issues, where it's just this endless due process in areas where the only process should be, this is the president's determination, now go execute on it. So that is my non-lawyer's take, and the lawyers can now convince me of the folly of my views and the dangerousness of them to our constitutional governance.
No, you're 100% right. There's no need for and also you're not even wrong on the law. Like there actually is a provision of the law, maybe not the president, but in effect the president, because if the
The State
Secretary of
Department,
State,
right? Yeah,
right,
exactly.
makes that determination, you get to go home. They might try and challenge that,
Right.
but and to the extent there's due process, I mean, the process, I don't know how long it takes, but it is limited. You get to show up for a hearing, not in front of a federal judge, but in front of an immigration judge, who's basically going to ask the deporting authority, like, did the Secretary of State in fact make this invocation? Yes. Okay. Bye bye. Uh,
Right.
right. And so, and there's more than that. I mean, some of these cases, I mean, the fact that they're making these guys a cause celeb is amazing. I mean, Mahmoud Khalil, the Colombia guy, just flat out omitted big pieces of his resume from his application for a green card, including that he worked for UNRWA, the completely infiltrated by Hamas organization in Gaza. And he was working, how long he worked for the British government, and the fact that he was a member of this Columbia University Apartheid Divest organization or club. He didn't mention that on his green card application. Well, gee, fraud, actually, in addition to every other independent prong on which we can deport you, you committed fraud too. So yeah, I think all these people should be deported. I think it's good that they're being deported. And yeah, I hope it continues.
Yeah, and just really quickly, I mean, the only thing I'm offended by is I'm offended that we're not deporting so many people that I actually have to know individual names. Like, I just want us to be deporting any of these guys who litter, like even, right? Like, you're foreigner. We don't need you in here unless you're behaving perfectly. It's like America is sort of doing just fine, and my complaint is not that we have three or four that I'm aware of, but that we don't have three or 400 such that I can't even keep track of who the left is outraged about this week.
So I think a couple things. I think there are some issues that are getting conflated here. At the end of the day, I think I agree. All of the examples that I've seen are people who should easily be deportable. I do think that there's a sliding scale. If you do have a green card, that I think there is some process due. The question is what, and it's an establishment of the facts, right? So if you're legally in the country as opposed to illegally in the country, I think you should have some access to a hearing that determines the facts of the matter, right? So like, let's say you have two people named Li Fong, right? Like,
Right, sure.
you don't want to be deporting the wrong Li Fong, and there needs to be a venue where people can essentially dispute the facts, underlying facts of their deportation. And generally speaking, I think that's immigration courts, right? The problem with the problem with the Khalil case is that the entire case is now being hinged on First Amendment grounds.
Right.
And that's an inappropriate way to think about it. And there I completely agree with you, Jeremy. Like that's an inappropriate way to think about this, because this is a person who did not have the right, or had a very conditional right, to stay in the country, right? And of course, now it shows that he lied on his application for a green card, which itself is deportable. But even before that, right, just this kind of activity, somebody who's here on a green card, even though they're legally here, even though they're a legal permanent resident, does not have, there are all kinds of restrictions on having a green card that don't apply to citizens. I mean, starting with the fact that you can't vote, right? That would obviously be unconstitutional to withdraw that right from a citizen. But you are here on a conditional basis. And if you violate any of those conditions, you can be booted from the country. And one of the interesting or funnier little tidbits that's floating around in a City Journal article on this matter, on the Khalil case specifically, one of his lawyers does a training with activists warning people on green cards that this kind of political activity can jeopardize their immigration status in the United States. So this is something that is well understood. It's well understood when you sign the documents to get your green card, right? And so the entire framing of these cases is illegitimate. That being said, I do think there needs to be some venue in which to establish facts. If you have somebody who disputes the underlying facts of what the government is laying out, I think they need to have some kind of quick venue to dispute that and have process. But I think that is, that's a speed bump. That's not something that is going to prevent the president from exercising his power to go ahead and deport foreign nationals that he believes are contrary to the foreign policy of the United States, or contrary to the well-being of the United States. And just one more thing that I agree with that Jeremy said: if the president is singling you out, like, ipso facto, like you don't need any more argument, essentially. Like you have made yourself such an undesirable alien that the president of the United States is aware of your presence. That's really, really strong evidence.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, there was a university professor at one of the Ivy Leagues. It might have been Brown or Yale, but we interviewed her lawyer on Rising a few weeks ago.
Mm.
And she was targeted for removal because she was part of the Sammy Dune network. And her lawyer was using this very cagey language about whether or not she was actually a member of the network, and then eventually denied it. And her name is literally on their website as one of their like prized alumni or something. And he starts going into this comparison to McCarthyism by saying, have you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? The entire time that he was going through this argument, I'm just sitting there thinking to myself, like, yeah, if you're a communist, then I don't want you to have a green card. That's not an argument in your defense when we're talking about the extremely high privilege of getting legal status in the United States and having the privilege of being an immigrant. Like we should have incredibly strict parameters on who we let into this country because it is such a privilege to have legal access to American land and to the privileges that come with a student visa or a green card. So the idea that it's just a free for all and they get to enjoy all of the rights of American citizenship is just fundamentally antithetical to the entire idea of what our immigration system should be. So everyone, I think, has been on the left has been framing this in a way that just rejects the idea of selectivity when it comes to the American immigration process, which is why it's been such an eye-rolling endeavor to listen to their very thin defenses of their clients and their activists and the people they support.
All right. So moving on, next is Inez to talk about Trump closing the Department of Education.
Yeah, I mean, it's really been one of those Trump administration weeks where something as monumental as closing or taking steps to begin to close a cabinet level department in the United States is like third on the agenda, right? It only happened a few days ago, but it's already old news. So the Trump administration is fulfilling a decades long Republican promise to start winding down the Department of Education. So the president had a signing ceremony where he signed this executive order, which directs the secretary to take steps to start doing this. Now, what this means in practice, as I said, maybe, I don't know, 3-4 episodes back, is something that is quite short of the catastrophizing on the left, but nevertheless, I think is a very meaningful thing to do that will get rid of, at least if it won't, solve all the problems of American education, it at least will get this pernicious bureaucratic force, sort of further from classrooms and students, and will not impact in any substantial way that we wouldn't want to. And I'll get to that in a moment. The funding in terms of K-12 funding, Title I funds, IDEA funds, any of those things. So first, this really is basically like, there are some pieces of what the department does that are line appropriated by Congress that the Trump administration cannot undo unilaterally. But what they can do is move them around and essentially and reduce staff, right? So they've already let go half the employees of the Department of Education. And to be clear, this is a department where the average salary was over $200,000 a year. It doesn't teach a single student. It doesn't, pay a single teacher. These are bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. Who are losing their jobs. But so that's sort of a cost saving already. There are pieces of the portfolio, as I said. So for example, the management of the student loan portfolio, which is a huge part of what the Department of Education does, that is moving over to the Small Business Administration. And then a lot of these funds will just be sent directly back to the states without all of these, in my view, very pernicious grants and strings attached to them, right? So you have this funding that is supposed to shore up and it's still a small amount of funding. 90% of the funding comes from the states and localities, but it's supposed to shore up in those localities that, for example, don't have a big tax base. Maybe they're poorer districts, right? So they get some money from the federal government that's appropriated by Congress to try to equalize some of the spending in those poorer districts. That money is now just going to flow directly. Instead of flowing through the Department of Education, the bureaucrats write a bunch of strings that attach to the money that then the districts have to like sort of apply for and do all this compliance and hire their own administrative staff to do that. That money is just going to flow directly to the state, to the district, right? So in many ways, this will be an improvement. They won't have to spend as much money on compliance. And then what really the left is upset about, where they're finally getting to the point where they're admitting this because the winding down of the department is starting to happen, and they can't catastrophize about how this is going to be, terrible for disabled students or whatever it is. They're starting to actually admit that this is the real problem. Once the department starts to wind down its functions, then the piece of it that's OCR, which is the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education, eventually, I imagine, will be placed back under DOJ, which is really where it should be, right? So there's an office that's responsible for enforcing the Civil Rights Act within various educational contexts and educational institutions that are getting federal money. There is a lot the Trump administration is doing with OCR right now. All of the enforcement actions that we've seen against Columbia University, against UPenn, right, against the state of Maine for allowing, men to continue to play in women's sports in schools in Maine, right? All of those enforcement actions are running through the Department of Education. So I think the tricky thing is how to enforce the Civil Rights Act and ensure that the educational pieces of the Civil Rights Act are being enforced in accordance with the views of the Trump administration, which is, by the way, a huge improvement over Republican administrations of the past that did not bother to do that. They only undid what the left is doing instead of, in my view, correctly and aggressively using the Civil Rights Act titles that prohibit racial discrimination at these institutions, and making sure that these institutions are actually not discriminating on the basis of race when it comes to white students or Asian students or Jewish students. So anyway, there's quite a lot of loose ends to tie up, but that process has begun. The way the Trump administration's gone about it actually signals to me that they are very, very aware of this, the way that they're going about putting various pieces into different portfolios, making sure that the parts of Department of Ed that are actually helping students, helping families are going to a new home, or they're going directly those responsibilities back to the states and the districts. They're not getting abandoned. They're not using a hatchet rather than a scalpel. Actually, this all indicates to me that they know exactly what they're doing so far, and they're doing a very good job. So bottom line, this is an old Republican promise. Reagan couldn't fulfill it. The Bushes couldn't fulfill it. Donald Trump, the only difference in this case between Trump and previous Republican presidents is that Trump is actually doing what Republicans have said they are going to do for decades and failed to do. So with that, I'll throw it out to the rest of the group. What do you think the sort of play on this? I mean, Democrats do have this message that it's going to destroy education or whatever. I tend to think that message won't hold up as people just continue to go to school and realize that the only thing that's really dropping is a note from OCR telling your school that it has to let, boys in the girls' locker room. But I don't know how you think that's going to play, or do you think that it's going to create backlash against the president, or, how do you think this is all going to work out? Because it is a big step. It's something that was considered impossible to do in Washington, D.C. just a few short months ago.
I think people are relatively aware of the fact that as the Department of Education has gotten larger, as spending has increased, educational outcomes have gotten significantly worse. And I think they noticed this acutely in the post-pandemic period with the massive learning loss that so many American students have experienced. So it doesn't feel as revolutionary to them as it might have 10 years ago. And I agree with the case that you executed, Inez, but I would just add that I think Linda McMahon deserves a lot of credit here because she took this job knowing that she would likely be involved in actually winding down her own position. And we asked her about this earlier this week, and she was like, yeah, I walked in fully clear-eyed. I knew exactly what Trump's plans were, and I took the job knowing that I would have to execute this vision. And she's also been involved in lobbying Congress to try to pass legislation to actually codify the full closure of the Department of Education, as opposed to just like moving parts around and shuttering what they can. So I think that, that type of unselfishness in service of a greater good is really admirable.
Yeah, I'd say, if I want to unapologetically say best GOP president of my lifetime with zero irony, I'd point to stuff like this. I am actually probably the only one on this group chat old enough. I mean, I was a kid, but I remember Reagan promising to close the Department of Education when it would have been much easier to do because it had just been started by Jimmy Carter. It never happened, right? And here we have Trump actually doing it. And Inez, thank you actually for walking me through the bureauc as well as the audience, obviously the sort of bureaucratic happenings, because I think the real key point here is we actually are sending half of these guys home, and as long as we don't run afoul of some stupid district judge, which doubtless we will do, that is going to be a
Don't
durable.
worry, we will, but all of those cases are winding their way through the courts. I'm
Yeah.
sure this one will be just another one.
Yeah, I mean, but sending people home is a durable win, right? Like that's not, as long as it's not undone, that will have a big difference. I'd say the one kind of thing that I would like to do as an addendum, you mentioned kind of that we're going to have a lot of these funds flow directly through. I would love our messaging very overtly, if there's some way to do this, that we are like sending some portion of these bureaucrat salaries we're saving to hire local teachers in your school, because that's how I think we're sending it back to these districts under some legal authority that is, you use this to hire additional instructional staff or whatever. I mean, I don't know. Again, not being a lawyer, I don't know how you'd have to tie that up with a bow, but I think that doing something like that where you can point to a very specific win of, no, actually what we did is we just fired a bunch of useless bureaucrats and now you have more or better paid educators in your classroom. I think that's how you kind of overcome all of the democratic messaging on this, which will be screaming that it's the end of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to see the administration doing something. We've been talking about eliminating the Department of Education for 30 something years, at least 40, and now Trump is essentially signed an executive order to say do everything you can to accomplish that end within the bounds of the law. Good. Obviously, the Democrats are squealing. They will be squealing. It's bureaucracy. It's staffed with their members. Uh, I'm really, really glad to see that they're taking steps. I don't know how successful they're going to be, but go for it. I'm happy. Anyway, moving on. Next is Amber on the Democrats' hunt for a new leader.
Yeah, so the Democrats have been pretty listless over the past couple of months. I think that's no surprise to anyone here on the panel. Their approval rating is at a near all-time low. They have all publicly admitted that they only intend to fight against Trump, but haven't even really indicated what exactly that means. Is they don't know what it means because they had this huge fight with Chuck Schumer, who didn't want to oppose a CR that effectively just continued Biden level spending. And there was a massive massive uprising from the Democratic base over this. But recently there have been a few figures trying to sort of take over the mantle of the Democratic Party in the wake of Schumer getting blasted by the more progressive wing of the party. And there's been a few key names that have risen to the top of the crop, I guess you could say. And Bernie Sanders, who is in his mid 80s, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are now on an oligarchy tour, an anti-oligarchy tour, going around the US, trying to make the case to voters that their vision of left-wing economic populism is the future for the Democratic Party. But as appealing as I think Bernie had been to Democrats in the past two election cycles, well, specifically 2016 and 2020, it seems incredibly silly to attach himself at the hip to someone who embodies the type of toxic woke identity politics that has been plaguing the Democratic Party and in large part led to their failure in this past election. I don't know why he would want to be associated with her except for some kind of attempt to appear more in touch, younger, to try to remain relevant. But any type of left-wing economic populist message that's tainted by wokeness is going to fail. So this seems incredibly wrong-headed to me. And then you also have emerging Jasmine Crockett, this congresswoman from Texas, who has repeatedly put her foot in her mouth over the past couple of weeks, saying incredibly stupid things like the Signal chat wouldn't have happened if there were a black woman in the room, calling Governor Abbott Governor Hot Wheels, um, which has led to sort of universal condemnation. And then just generally running around on CNN panels and turning herself into a spectacle without any real substance behind any of the things that she's saying. She's just being as nasty as possible to try to get headlines and fundraise off of it. So that doesn't seem very wise for the Democratic Party to want to elevate her. And then on the complete opposite side of these sort of young upstarts, these young progressives, you have Joe Biden, of all people, re-entering the fray. There was a report from Politico last week that Joe Biden is trying to take over the fundraising and operation of the Democratic National Committee, the way that Obama did after, while he was in office in 2008 to 2016. Except, obviously, huge difference is that Democrats don't want Joe Biden to be the leader of their party because he left them a horrible record that they had to run on ahead of the 2024 election. He's incredibly old. He is in cognitive decline and just carries so much baggage and clearly not a lot of operational know-how either in terms of how to run a party apparatus. And I thought it was notable that since he left office, he's basically just been tweeting out memorial tweets like, oh, it's Women's History Month or it's Black History Month. But this past week, he actually tweeted out something about the anniversary of Obamacare. So actually wading back into political policy related issues. So clearly he's angling for something. And is it even Joe? Is it Jill? Who could possibly know? But the fact that these are sort of the three main options for the Democratic Party, AOC/Bernie, Jasmine Crockett, and then Joe Biden, seems incredibly depressing for them. So I'm curious for what the panel thinks on, like, one, who is going to win ultimately this Democratic civil war that's breaking out, and two, who would be the best person for the Democrats, and then alternatively, the best person for the Republicans to win this Democratic infighting.
Yeah, I agree with you, Amber. I mean, it's sort of shocking how bad their choices really are. I mean, the Tea Party, I mean, I actually think if you look, the Tea Party, for all the fact that it arguably got ahead of the voters on a lot of things, actually injected a lot of useful new blood into the Republican Party, including people like Rubio, who are not even thought of as a Tea Party guy anymore, and now is sort of like an establishment guy, but actually were people who had a message that was better than the sclerotic GOP establishment. But when I look at these Democrats, I'm like, every single one of these guys, not just a policy disaster, but they're a political disaster for the party. And I think sort of most visibly where you see this with somebody like Bernie even, and I tweeted about this, who maybe does have a populist left-wing message, but they're in denial that they're the party of the oligarchs. And I don't say that out of I wish we had more oligarchs. I'd love to recruit a few more so that we had a little more balance of power. But for Bernie to have this populist economic message, he's just functionally in the wrong party to be giving that right now. And so it's a huge problem for them. It's delightful for me to see from afar. As to who wins it, I fear that it actually might be Gavin Newsom, just because he's so slick, he's so smooth. But then again, I think the silver lining of somebody like that, who on paper would check a lot of boxes that would solve the Dems' problems and is certainly comfortable enough in being a pathological liar to be a successful Democratic politician, is at the end of the day, Newsom still has his record in California, and it's disastrous, including all the millions of people who have fled under his governorship. And I just don't know that he can fully run away from that. So I think that this problem that the Democrats have with their leadership that you've identified is a huge and perhaps even somewhat durable strategic advantage for the GOP right now.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Amber, it's not universal condemnation. I thought the Hot Wheels thing was funny. I think if Trump had said
I don't disagree with you.
Laughing right now. Hot Wheels comment. She did tack a really disingenuous lie onto it after, saying that it wasn't about him being in a wheelchair and it was about, what was it? It was something totally ridiculous. Did anybody else?
She was like, I said he was nothing but a hot mess. I was talking about his policies. Just own it. Just own it.
Trump would have owned that in a second.
Yeah, it is objectively a funny phrase, but when she's getting awards from disability groups and it's speaking
yeah,
at the Human Rights Campaign of all places.
Of
Like,
course,
okay,
in the leftist framework, that's an inappropriate joke to
yes,
make. Just saying for the record that I think it's funny. I'm not offended by that comment. It's really more offensive that she puts on this ghetto black scent when she obviously did not come from that background whatsoever. It's completely fake. There's a bunch of videos of her speaking like a normal person. So really vibes of Hillary there. But no, I mean, I agree with you that there is at least, they've suffered an actual defeat, right? They're in disarray. It's true. The Dems are in disarray. But I wouldn't get too confident, not because, I do think there's an outside chance that Gavin Newsom can just lie his way to the top. I mean, he will just say wildly disparate and contradictory things 5 minutes between them to two different audiences. Never underestimate the power of somebody who's willing to lie with a straight face that way. That being said, I do think they don't have a lot of good options right now, but if we know anything, it's that political power isn't permanent, that things will change. Somebody will rise up to fill that vacuum and represent the close to half the country that is very, very unhappy with Trump right now. That's inevitable. I think what hasn't been happening for the last 30 to 40 years, which is why politics has gotten so frustrating and so, sort of depressing and blackpilling for the right until now, is that even when we were in power, we weren't in power. Right. Even when we elected Republicans, nothing of the essential machine of the left was actually hampered in any way. At worst, it was slowed down for a few years. Now we see the Trump administration actually dismantling that machine, whether that's, fundamentally shifting the relationship between the president and the executive branch that was functioning as an unelected branch of the Democratic Party, whether that's going after payments to the NGOs that are also just this entire ecosystem that is all funded with federal money, going after universities that are funded by federal money, just going after piece by piece this leftist machine that functioned whether Republicans were elected or whether Democrats are elected. So that's why I definitely agree with what Jeremy said in the other segment, which is I think this is the best Republican administration, certainly in my lifetime. I think it's arguable to say this is the best administration in a century. In terms of actually executing on the goals that Republican voters or right-wing voters want when they vote for their politicians. So the problem is not that political power is temporary and that, yes, eventually some new dark force will rise on the left to challenge us, right? The difference here is while we're in power for this temporary period of time, at least we are actually notching W's in a way that is serious and actually compromises the ability of the left to execute their goals. That's really all I was asking for all those years that I was frustrated. So I really find this to be a very encouraging moment.
Yeah, I'll be brief here. Jasmine Crockett is just a ridiculous person. This is, I mean, the fact that she came out, first off, called Greg Abbott Hot Wheels, at least just own it. You made a joke. We all know what you're referring to. The idea that this is really in reference to the fact that he bust illegal immigrants to New York. We all know you're lying, and it's just such a bad and obvious, ridiculous lie. But it makes sense because this is the same woman who, as you guys pointed out, knows how to speak in a normal accent. She went to an elite private school that cost something like $40,000 a year. I mean, I went to one of those schools. She knows how to talk like a normal person. And the idea that she would just pretend to be this, utterly from the streets black, give me a break. That's not you. You're wearing a costume in the same way that Hillary Clinton was wearing a costume when she talked about, I'm done tired or something like that. These people, just ridiculous. Anyway, so enough with that. Final thoughts. My final thoughts are, in this case, actually kind of, there's a real deep parallel between what's going on here and what's going on in Israel. And I don't know that it's getting necessarily enough coverage, but there's this very interesting domestic crisis in Israel going on where you have an attempt to fire the head of MI5 and the attorney general. And those people saying, no, you can't fire us. And they're going to the Supreme Court to be like, no, you can't fire us. Israel has a very, very bizarre system, and it's kind of gone under the radar, I think, because Netanyahu and the government realized that in a world where Biden was the president, there was literally no sympathy whatsoever for the Israeli government and their internal problems dealing with their deep state. But they have a deep state. It's probably more powerful than ours in many ways relative to their government. And I'm just, I think we need to like keep following that. And it's one of these cases where it actually would be useful to have sort of American pressure, like given that, the left in that country has had no problem taking money from the Biden administration. We should use our pressure to inform them that we expect these deep state bureaucrats to respect the will of the Democratic government and to, resign their posts as head of the security services when the elected government demands that they do so, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say to channel Cato the Elder, judicial supremacy delenda est. I mean, I was going to say that even before you made your comments. I mean, to me, that's the whole game. And the example of Israel is a sobering one because ultimately Netanyahu had to back down against the Supreme Court, and I think it badly hurt his power. We have to win against the judicial supremacists. That's the whole game at this point. It overarches all of these issues. And if we don't assert, say, the president's fundamental Article 2 powers to do certain things, absent judicial review, we might as well just go home. And I'd say that's kind of the headline. I think even some of the people saying, well, maybe the Supreme Court will save us, they're thinking in the wrong categories. I mean, yes, the Supreme Court may save us in certain things, but there have to be some certain things where we may even need to challenge the court in the way that Lincoln did, if I can put on my Claremont hat. And that's going to really determine whether or not we're ultimately successful in doing anything other than sort of temporarily setting back the deep state.
My final thoughts are on Jay Bhattacharya and Marty McCary being confirmed. Jay Bhattacharya to lead the NIH and then Marty McCary to lead the FDA. These are two of the best picks that Trump has put forward in terms of taking on the public health bureaucracy and the health establishment. They were incredibly courageous when it came to batting down a lot of the misinformation surrounding the COVID pandemic, consistently arguing for common sense public policy in relation to trying to prevent spread while also making sure that people were not locked in their homes for years and that kids were able to attend school. And they were systematically attacked for it, both subject to the Biden censorship regime using funding through NGOs to take on social media companies to battle them. Jay Bhattacharya, of course, was part of the Murthy v. Missouri lawsuit regarding the Biden administration censorship. So I'm very happy to see that both of those individuals have been confirmed to their government posts. I think they're going to do an excellent job.
Yeah, I have a bit of a light final thought to close us out. Yesterday was hashtag equal pay day, which a bunch of Democrats jumped on, Sheldon Whitehouse, my governor, Governor Hochul. And I'm hoping that in this new age where the vast majority of Americans realize that the legacy media have been lying to them about all sorts of things. I'm hoping that finally this Sisyphean work of people like Christina Hoff Sommers will be acknowledged. This equal pay day, quote unquote, which is that women are not systematically underpaid for quote unquote equal work. The differences, the so-called wage gap that first I think really went sort of into public consciousness when Obama started to cite it as 77 cents on the dollar. That is due to different choices women make about what majors to go into, what professions to go into, how many hours they work per week, even in the category of full time, whether they choose flexibility or higher pay. And about 60 gazillion other reasons why women and men are different and make different choices. And those different choices in aggregate, when you add them all up, which is all that statistic is, it's the median female wage versus the median male wage. When you control for all of those things, you see that the wage gap virtually disappears. And in fact, with young women, we see that young women who don't have kids, they make more than their comparably controlled for male counterparts. So this is just a lie. It's a statistical lie. It's something that was debunked by the Department of Labor, even under Obama, as he was going around saying it. His own Labor Department released a massive report, a meta report of all of the studies that have been done on this that basically said, yeah, there's a wage gap, but it's explainable by all of these factors. And when you control for those factors, the wage gap goes away. So it's just one of those things that's like really easily debunkable. It has been debunked by a million people. It has even been debunked in quote unquote legacy sources a few times. And yet people continue to cite it. Politicians continue to cite it. Legacy media outlets continue to cite it as though it's sort of some kind of indisputable fact. It's not. As a final cherry on this, gaps between men and women open up in virtually every employment context. One of them is in Uber that pays by algorithm. So there's a 7% wage gap between male and female drivers for Uber, even though it is paid by algorithm and there is not a person determining how much each driver gets that is capable of sexism or discrimination. So it turns out that female drivers drive slower and take more time between customers, and that's the explanation for the wage gap. So in any case, I hope that we can finally bury this talking point once and for all in this new glorious regime of 2025.
All right. Well, there we go. On behalf of Jeremy, Amber, and Inez, thanks for tuning in. I'm Will Chamberlain. See you at the next NatCon Squad.